Everyone's talking about it.
We're talking about inflation. Good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm Mitch Carr.
An inflation rate of 10.9%.
Sky-high inflation
and persistent inflation.
Food inflation in the Eurozone.
Fighting inflation appears to be the immediate battle.
The inflation, it is crushing hardworking families.
Here to refute some of the most common myths around that dirty word. You know him, you love him. Learn Liberty welcomes back.
I'm Antony Davies, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and co-host of the podcast Words and Numbers.
Myth 1. The price of this thing I buy went up. That's inflation.
This is a common misconception. People see the price of something go up. The price of milk goes up, the price of gas goes up, and people say, well, that's inflation. And it's not inflation. Inflation is a rise in the average price level. So during periods of inflation, it's possible that some prices are rising. It's also possible that some prices are falling. For example, from 2013 through 2020, the average price of air travel fell almost 3% per year at the same time that inflation was averaging 2% per year. So we had average prices going up, but this specific price going down. So we can't say anything about inflation by looking at a single price.
Myth 2. Inflation is caused by corporate greed.
Yeah, that's very interesting because here's the thing. From 1980 through 2020, inflation averaged less than 3% a year. But throughout 2021, inflation jumped to about 8%. So if indeed inflation is caused by corporate greed, then all of a sudden in 2020, corporations discovered that they could be greedy, and they started raising prices. This is clearly not the case. If corporations are greedy, they were greedy in periods of inflation. They're also greedy in periods of deflation. Inflation arises when the money supply grows faster than the production of goods and services. It has nothing to do with greed on the part of the corporations or anybody else. Even an economy comprised entirely of saints will experience inflation if the money supply grows faster than the economy.
Myth 3. The president is responsible for inflation.
Yeah, people like to point to individuals to blame, but presidents aren't responsible for inflation. There's little they can do to cause it. There's little they can do to fix it. The current bout of inflation we're experiencing was due to money printing, which was caused by deficits, which in turn were caused by politicians spending more money than they bring in. If we're to look to a root cause, the root cause is the printing of the money to fund the federal deficit. And that brings into question now who's responsible for the federal deficit. Well, the federal budget is an animal created by the House, the Senate, and the President combined. Those three groups together are responsible for the deficits which are being funded by the money printing, which in turn is causing the inflation. In 2020, the money supply growth tripled compared to what was happening prior to 2020. This is due largely to the fact that the federal government undertook stimulus spending. The federal government spent several $1 trillion more in 2020 than it typically does. In total, this contributed to the federal debt rising about 30%, a total of $7 trillion from 2020 to the present.